Welcome to our adult Sunday school class. Happy February. First Sunday school for the month of February 2024 already. So get to our screen share here. We are going through the whole Bible story. We have finished the age of the patriarchs. We are in the transition from the time frame of Joseph and Job to the birth of Moses, which is just around the corner for us. We are in Exodus chapter 1. We are getting our timeline and chronology from Egyptologist David Roll, his new chronology that fixes some obvious errors in what's accepted as the Orthodox chronology. And when that happens, it unintentionally lines up right with the Bible. That, of course, never has to change. So cool stuff there. And let's see. So we have left off here in Exodus chapter 1. We are now about the year 1535 BC, for those who are counting. The Lord's people have been in Egypt now for 126 years, and it's been mostly good up until recent times here. We're in the Middle Bronze Age 2A. Over in China, they're being led by Emperor Taiwu of their Shang Dynasty, their second dynasty after the Xia Dynasty. Egypt, where of course the Lord's people are at, they are being led by Pharaoh Neferhotep I. And it is not a pretty time. Let's see, it's boom, boom, boom. There we go. Mr. Neferhotep. This is the guy who, after Sobekhotep III, was the first one in the south of Egypt, the natural native Egyptian, resenting the infiltration and the growth of all these Hebrews in the north. So he rises up, Sobekhotep III did, as pharaoh in the south, and started enslaving the locals in that area. And we've got a document called the Brooklyn Papyrus from this time, listing the names of slaves, and some of them have Hebrew names right out of the Bible. And so what happens after him is we have two brothers. First is Neferhotep I, who takes that power and influence and expands it to even encompass the north. Now, in the north, they've had their own pharaohs, and their pharaohs are mixed blood with the Hebrews. In fact, it looks like Joseph's son Manasseh was the Pharaoh Reseneb, who was Pharaoh for all of 4 months before he died in his old age in his 90s. So we've got weaker pharaohs in the north who've been influenced by the Hebrews, through the line of Joseph and all of that, but natives in the south who are rising up and trying to reclaim Egypt for themselves. So there's this battle going on, this conflict, this issue going on internally with Egypt during their 13th dynasty here. This is the second intermediate period. We're past the high point of the Middle Kingdom with Joseph's pharaohs. We are before the New Kingdom with the famous Ramses II and all that. That comes much later on. Ramses is actually after the time of Solomon. So another national news around the globe about this time, the Old Kingdom of Assyria, gone. Larsa has been conquered by Babylon. Babylon is being led by Hammurabi, famous for his law code and all that went with that. So let's see, Hammurabi, a little back up here. Hammurabi. The problem is I put numbers to things, but then I move things around so the numbers don't stay the same. I forget to update the numbers sometimes. So Hammurabi. 15's back up here a little bit. There we go. This is Hammurabi receiving the law code from the sun god Shamash, who's a version of Noah's son Ham. And there is the law code written down there for folks. And Hammurabi's law code has some interesting similarities and differences from the law of Moses that will come later. So we'll talk about that when we get to the law of Moses. But Hammurabi was also quite the conqueror. He's more famous for his law code now, but he was also quite the conqueror. Over in Mari, in Mesopotamia, Shinar, Sumer, that land, we've got a king named Zimri-Lim. So Mari right over here. So Mari's right there in the center. So Babylon's up here. Assyria was up there, and they'll be back. And so we've got Ison and Larsa all down there. And so they're, of course, Larsa's gone now. But Mari up here in the middle with King Zimri-Lim, they aren't going to be lasting long themselves either. This is the culture of the folks from Mari. So all these different city-states are kind of bumping elbows and bucking for power, and Hammurabi is pretty much dominating. So back to the Lord's people in Egypt, in the line of Christ from Jacob's son Judah down to Jesus. In that lineage, we have alive right now Ram, who I put at about 68 years old right now, and his son Aminadab has been born. He's about 9 years old now, about the time we're looking at. So all of that sets the stage for us, brings us to where we left off last week, Exodus chapter 1. Let's refresh verses 15 through 20. So this is dealing with Pharaoh Neferhotep I. This is what we're talking about here. Exodus 1, 15 to 20. Then the king of Egypt, Neferhotep I, spoke to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was named Shiphrah, the other was named Puah. And he said, when you are helping the Hebrew women to give birth and see them upon the birth stool, if it is a son, then you shall put him to death. But if it is a daughter, then she shall live. But the midwives feared God and did not do as the king of Egypt, Neferhotep I, had commanded them, but let the boys live. So the king of Egypt, Neferhotep I, called for the midwives and said to them, why have you done this thing and let the boys live? The midwives said to Pharaoh Neferhotep I, because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, for they are vigorous and give birth before the midwife can get to them. So God was good to the midwives, and the people multiplied and became very mighty. So that plan against God and his people didn't work. So talking about this time frame and the rise of power and influence of the southern kingdom and Neferhotep in the south. So let's zoom in here a bit. So this is the northern delta, referred to as Lower Egypt. And from here on down, this is called the Nile Valley. And this is southern Egypt, which was referred to as upper because the Nile River flows from south to the north, emptying into the Mediterranean. So place right here called Ichitawe is where Pharaoh Neferhotep I is. Up here in Avaris with the Hebrews is where the northern Pharaoh is. And we'll talk about the connections between the two and what happens and setting the stage for Moses's birth in all of this as we go. But one of the things we touched on last week that Neferhotep did, because here's the problem. Everything revolves around money and trade, right? The more people you can trade with, the better deals you can get, and the more bang you can get for your buck. And so the more prosperous you can be. Well, these guys in the south here have been having to deal with the guys in the north being, of course, they're at the entrance to the Mediterranean, where you've got the land of Canaan, you got Syria and Phoenicia, you've got Turkey up here, you've got Greece over there. So all of this is coming through here. Well, what Neferhotep decided to do, he decided to reopen trade with the rest of Africa, including Kush, which is Ethiopia down to the south. And he was so successful at that he was able to bypass these guys in the north because these guys wanted that stuff from further down in Africa. So he became stronger and the folks up north became weaker. And again, this is the environment that Noah's going to be born into. So talking about some of these places, like we've got Byblos right here. Let me close that. Or not. So Byblos right here in Phoenicia, modern Lebanon. Byblos has been trading with Egypt since the days of the Old Kingdom and kept the close political ties with them. So let's switch over to here while that's doing its thing. So here's we're going to see something interesting about Byblos related to Egypt here. So while Byblos is there on the coast, nice place to be, good place for trading. See with that. Let's grab that and let's grab that and that. And lastly, that. Cool, grab those. Get back to that. And get back to, let's do this. Google is powerful, right? Google Earth is powerful, right? Well, they can't handle the Bible. We're too powerful for them. Let's see. So we can stop right there as an example. So, okay, so that's what we're dealing with here. So here's Byblos up here. So Byblos, with its location right here on the Eastern Mediterranean, at the foot of the Lebanese Cedar Mountains, Byblos is ideally placed to act as a supply, the word is entrepot, which is a kind of center of trade, for the Egyptian trading fleet. Good quality wood was actually much in demand in Egypt. They didn't have it there. They in turn had the produce of Africa for supply to those in this area called the Levant. So here's something interesting that was discovered. Maurice Dunand in the 1920s, there at Byblos, discovered a large slab of limestone. It's now in the Beirut Museum. So what did this thing have? It had, go back to Neferhotep I here. It had right here on it this. Oh, we'll go back to it. Well, what is that? Well, on this slab of limestone in over in Byblos, they had this. This is Egyptian hieroglyphs. So this is the sign for Hotep. This is a cake that's on a reed mat. Hotep means to be content. This is the sign that is the lungs and the windpipe of an ox. Yeah, so you got the lungs down here and then the big long windpipe over here. This is the sign for beautiful. The word in Egyptian is Nefer. So this is beautiful and content. So this is Neferhotep. This is the hieroglyphs for the Egyptian pharaoh Neferhotep I, but it's over here in Byblos. And they found it there in the 1920s. So yeah, so that shows the power and influence that Neferhotep I now had. And also shows the time frame, who he is with. He was during the time that Yantanamu was in Byblos, Zimrilim in Mari, Hammurabi in Babylon. So this all fits together. We see all these people interacting with each other. So any reactions, thoughts, or questions, observations on the rise of Neferhotep I in the south? All good? Then we move on to the next pharaoh, which is Sihathor, however that's pronounced. Something like that. Right here. Sihathor. He rules, it looks like a long, like over a year, but no, it's actually, he just kind of crosses over. So that's a little something from his time frame. Sihathor was the son of Neferhotep I. So after Neferhotep died under questionable circumstances, his boy reigned for about 3 months. There is some suspicion among the courtiers that the unfortunate accident that brought his reign to an abrupt end was no accident at all. So that makes way for Neferhotep's brother, the uncle of the son, to reign, and we'll get to him in a second. But there's something else that's happening in technology at this time that's going to play a factor in things. What did the Egyptians chase Moses and when the Egyptians were chasing Moses and the Israelites, what were they chasing them on? Chariots. Absolutely. What's that? Chariots. Horses and chariots were not native to Egypt in this sense, or even Mesopotamia in this sense. They come from further north in the mountain regions. The Hurrians were the ones who were kind of masters of this. They actually the original Aryans up there, bringing the horses from the north, and were able to be masters of the horses. So they'd be hired by other nations to master horses for them. And so what's this have to do with the chariot? Well, the light chariot could not have been pulled too effectively by a team of horses without an essential bit of equestrian equipment, the bit. This too was a northern invention outside the Fertile Crescent. It was introduced soon after the Old Assyrian period, which we're past now, and the simple invention of the horse bit transformed military tactics, permitting that light two-wheel chariot to be driven at great speed and with better maneuverability. So so we see the timing of this fitting with what we're going to see take place. So we'll come back to chariots a little later on. So after the 3-month reign of Sihathor, the son of Neferhotep I, we now have Neferhotep's brother, Sobekhotep IV. This is the guy. This is the guy who raises Moses. So let's talk about this guy. And that's his cartouche with his name and all that stuff there. So this is the guy. So there was a gentleman named Artapanus, who was a Jewish historian in Alexandria, Egypt, in the 200s BC. So roughly the same time that the Hebrew Bible is being translated into Greek for the Septuagint. Brother Tim, great to see you. So this guy writes about some things. He writes a book called Concerning the Jews. So he writes the history, and he talks about this time frame and the different things going on. And a lot of things that he writes make sense with the Bible and make sense with all these other factors that we're seeing come together. Some things he writes about. Egypt is going to be invaded from the south, and we're going to talk about that. He talks about how the Egyptians recognize there's some folks over in Mesopotamia called the Anakim, which of course Anakim are in the Bible. He lists some of them, the rulers of Anak, and lists them as enemies. So this guy, Artapanus, in the 200s BC, writes a history going back to this time frame called Concerning the Jews, and a number of things he says are consistent. They mention a city, Heliopolis in the Greek is the Egyptian city of On, the sun cult, Helio referring to sun. So that fits. Building works undertaken by the Israelites, slaves, Ramses and Pithom, as described earlier in Exodus, that all lines up. One of the things he mentions in there that fits, Tarawet is the hippopotamus goddess of wet nursing, who is a manifestation of Isis. I did not make that up. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. I try not to mock people and things, but sometimes, yeah. It's like, we didn't have enough gods, so let's make this one. Let's come up with this one. But again, that was actually a manifestation of Isis. And we know Isis is no joke. That's Isis, that's Inanna, that's Ishtar, that's Aphrodite. We've talked about the demonic spirit and influence behind all these things. These man-made idols that themselves are nothing. Isis protects her child Horus by hiding him in the Delta marshes. Artapanus talks about many kings of Egypt in this second intermediate period, these dynasties 13 through 17, where sure enough, we see that there was a political breakup after the powerful Middle Kingdom of the time of Joseph. Artapanus talks about the political uncertainty in this first half of this 13th dynasty. The average reign length of the kings is only about 5 years. Talks about the Ethiopians in the south, which Ethiopians is a later update of the name for those from Cush, their capital Kerma down south. He mentions a chieftain in the area of Arabia named Dragul, who could be Rul, who's another name for Jethro. Zipporah was his daughter, sister of his son Hobab. Of course, Moses will have an interaction with them. So let's talk about this Pharaoh, Sobekhotep IV, and what we know from Artapanus about this guy. So the boy king who died under mysterious circumstances, Sihathor, his uncle, Sobekhotep, brother of Neferhotep, he now seizes the reins of power. He takes the coronation name of Khnefre, the perfection of Re, the sun god, shines on the horizon. When they became Pharaoh, they took on an additional name. So Artapanus, writing this history, calls him Khenofres, an Egyptian name, or kind of a Greekified name for Khnefre. He tells us he's the one who raised Moses. So Sobekhotep means the crocodile is at peace. which is what they like because of the Nile and the crocodiles. And the Nile is the source of their livelihood. So if the crocodile's at peace, the Nile's at peace, then they're going to be prosperous. But it was not a peaceful time. This was a bad dude who raised Moses, ironically. So, mentioned that the guys in the north were mixed blood with the Hebrews. Well, at the time of Sobekhotep IV, we have a pharaoh in the north named Sechem Hemri Kutawi Pantjenu. Artapanus calls him by the Greek version Palmonothes. So we've got this guy here who's mixed blood with Hebrews, pharaoh in the north, ruler in that Delta kingdom. So what happens? Sobekhotep IV, this guy right here, makes overtures to the northern pharaoh who's getting older, and an alliance is sealed between the two royal houses through the marriage of Sobekhotep IV to Pantjenu's daughter. Her name is Merit. Artapanus, Greekifying things, calls her Maris, the eldest daughter. This union completes the takeover of the kingdom of the north there in Avaris and the Upper Egyptian state. So Sobekhotep IV has now peacefully unified all the land of Egypt once more. He's gained sovereignty over the delta there with its large population of Hebrews, including the people there in Goshen. So now that he's got full control, the phrase absolute power corrupts absolutely. Once people have free reign and full control, they take and run with it. So are people of Israel there in the land of Goshen not going to get any prettier for them? Not long before the state organized oppression of those Hebrews living in Upper Egypt that were living down in the southern parts of Upper Egypt, it's now stretched to include those in the north. That pharaoh in the north, Pantjenu, he reigned for 25 years. But during his reign, with the influence of the south, many of the rights of Jacob's descendants have been gradually eroded. The Israelites of Goshen now suddenly find themselves in truly dire circumstances, as Exodus tells us. They're bonded to their Egyptian neighbors as domestic servants. Many of the young men sent into forced labor on behalf of Pharaoh Sobekhotep IV and his building projects. So in their main city of Avaris, where Joseph's tomb is and all that stuff, the largest of the dwellings, those once occupied by the Israel tribe chieftains, are now handed over to the Egyptian overseers. The original Hebrew owners, they're now rehoused, much smaller lean-to huts built within the compounds. They're set to work as domestic servants for their new masters. The rest of the growing Israelite population there is housed in overcrowded squalor on the east side of the palace settlement. Here, the mud brick houses, which are now of Egyptian design, are woven together in a tight network of compounds separated by narrow lanes. This is a Hebrew ghetto. This is the barrio. This is what this is turned into. The population is so densely packed into the available space, burials have to be located within the compounds and even under the floors of the dwellings. Yeah. So we have not only written records, but we also have physical remains. Anthropological, fancy word for the study of the humans, anthropological studies. We have the skeletal remains from this time frame, from this area. From here in Avaris, they show that the Hebrew population, these folks who came over from the continent of Asia, they developed serious health problems that were associated with poverty and malnourishment. Parasitic diseases, such as anemia, were observed to have affected at least 1/3 of the population. Harris lines in the long bones indicated stunted growth. Life expectancy. Now, keep in mind, we have the folks who were born during born and raised during prosperity. And now this time is shifting. So those born under these harsher times are experiencing a totally different world than their fathers grew up in. Life expectancy is around 32 years. 29.7 for women, 34.4 for men. The evidence for the oppression of the Hebrew Asiatic population of Egypt in the 13th dynasty is there to be seen in the record. It fits exactly what the Bible tells us. So this guy, Sobekhotep IV, He strengthened his grip on power. He built up a large military force, loyal to the throne. During his long reign, Egyptian army commanders established for the first time a chariot force, right there stationed at Avaris in Goshen there. Now, horse-drawn chariots had been used in Egypt during the late Middle Kingdom, but only to transport the king and his high officials. But with these new developments in the warfare amongst those Hurrian nations in the north, they have shown and demonstrated how effective these chariots are now in set-piece battles. The speed with which a well-trained chariot force can now reach flashpoints and decimate infantry has totally transformed military tactics now. The Egyptians did not hesitate to adopt this new way of warfare and refine it to suit their own circumstances. They developed a much lighter, faster, two-man vehicle, four-spoked wheels. Over the centuries, the Egyptian rapid response force now grows to several thousand units, each consisting of a vehicle, two teams of horses, and a driver and an archer or spearman. So times are changing. The initial objective of this newly invented 13th dynasty mobile force was to control the local Hebrew population within that eastern delta, and at the same time, protect Egypt's northern border from invasion by sympathetic relatives up in the land of Canaan. So the chariot is perfectly suited for going across those flat lands between Egypt and across the Sinai Peninsula on into the Promised Land there. So that is the shifting state of affairs now that the Israelites are dealing with under Egypt. Any reactions or questions on that? Yeah. So now we have the birth of Miriam, Moses' sister, during the midst of all this happening. By the year 1531, the Israelites have now been in Egypt for 130 years. So what's happening? Now remember, the Israelites are going to leave Egypt and be dealing back in the Promised Land and that side of things, back on the continent of Asia. So what's happening over there? Well, remember Mari, kind of over here in the center. We got Babylon to the south here and Mari over here. 1531 BC, Hammurabi's 35th year, he attacks the city of Mari, there in northeast Syria, destroys the beautiful palace of King Zimrilim. We described the palace earlier. It had like 260 rooms and all that stuff. When the remains of the palace were unearthed in 1933, they found an archive of tablets written in that cuneiform writing. Over 25,000 of these they found. Most of them were administrative records and not letters, but one tablet was an inventory of presents that King Zimrilim of Mari received. And among that list of presents, he received a gold cup from Yantan-Amu of Byblos. So seeing that these folks that we're talking about, they are all interacting with each other. So Yantan-Amu of Byblos was a contemporary of Zimrilim of Mari, and they both ruled their city-states when Hammurabi sat on the throne. Now Zimrilim's reign comes to an end here when his palace is destroyed by Hammurabi, and we can now see that that's 1531 BC. So Mari is no more. Well, not long after Miriam is born, we have another birth. We have in 1529 BC, the birth of Aaron to Amram and Jochebed. Now, my ballpark, I put Amram at about 68 years old and Jochebed at about 76 years old. Remember, she's the generation above, she's his aunt. Well, the instructions to the midwives by Neferhotep I didn't work out. So his brother, Sobekhotep IV, has a new plan. So we pick up in Exodus chapter 1, verses 21 and 22. Exodus 1:21. Good news for the midwives. Because the midwives feared God, he established households for them. Amen. But now this new Pharaoh, the Sobekhotep IV, commanded all his people, saying, every son who is born, you are to throw into the Nile, but every daughter you are to keep alive. So we went from the midwives supposing being instructed to kill the males at birth, and that didn't work. So now the brother, Sobekhotep IV, says, just take them and just throw them in the Nile. All of them. Yeah, this was not pretty. And so this happened shortly after the birth of Aaron. Aaron was not subject to this, but his younger brother will be. This is referenced. Now let's read the one verse there. In Acts chapter 7, when Stephen is giving his spiritual account of what was happening here. Acts 7, verse 19, Stephen proclaims, "Is he who shrewdly took advantage of our nation, mistreated our fathers, in order that they would abandon their infants in the Nile, so that they would not survive." So that is Sobekhotep IV. So what do we see as a result of this in the archaeology, in the anthropology, studying the human remains we have from this time? Those surviving from this population that the Egyptians referred to as Amu, the population records of the 13th dynasty for them show, would you believe, a greater proportion of female slaves to male slaves? So, as I've mentioned before, when you dig down in archaeology, the deeper you go, the older in time you're going. And so they measure things in layers. So the top would be level A, then B or strata, A, B, C, D. So the lower down the alphabet, the older back in time you go. So we're in this area of Avaris, right over here, where the Hebrews are. It's now called Tel El Daba, is the excavation mound. So they're right up here, and that's the Exodus journey they'll be taking. So while that's being excavated and they're discovering the remains here, there's a team of Austrian archaeologists who've been here since like the 60s, and they've been just excavating for decades, discovering all these things. Let's zoom in here. Yeah, so as they're excavating in this area here, what are they finding at this point in time? Anthropological analysis of the skeletal remains by folks show more adult women were buried in the settlement than adult men, in keeping with the culling of the Israelite male children. It was discovered there was a higher percentage of infant burials here at Tel El Daba than is normally found at other archaeological sites of the ancient world. 65% of all the burials were those of children under the age of 18 months. Now, how does that compare with what's quote unquote normal? Based on modern statistical evidence obtained from pre-modern societies, we would expect the infant mortality rate to be around 20 to 30%. We're talking 65. This ain't natural. The discovery is also in keeping with the slaughter of the Israelite infant males by the Egyptians. So it was early in Sobekhotep IV's reign, the infamous decree went out to cull all the male infants of this expanding Hebrew community. King's advisors had determined the newly acquired slave population posed a potential threat to the security of the state. These Hebrews might rise in revolt if their already large numbers are permitted to grow any further. Given their background, their tribal structure, it was prudent to reduce the adult male population to the minimum required for Pharaoh's building program, while keeping the female population higher to maintain the domestic work levels on the Egyptian agricultural estates. So here in Avaris, at the heart of Israelite Goshen and throughout the land, newborn boys are wrenched from their mother's arms and smothered or drowned in the Nile and left for the crocodiles. Again, all over the sprawling city of Avaris here, tiny graves of the massacre victims have been unearthed by these Austrian excavators. Again, the normal infant grave population in ancient settlements is around 25%, 20 to 30. Here in Avaris, it reaches an astonishing 65%. That's almost 2/3. Further direct archaeological evidence of the tragedy comes from the statistics for the remaining adult population of the excavated Israelite graves. Every 5 female adult burials the archaeologists have unearthed, there are only corresponding 3 male burials. So fewer males survive to adulthood. And once again, the archaeological evidence lines up exactly with what the Bible tells us. Reactions? Thoughts, comments, questions? No joke?
Well, the females that had been taken to wife by the Egyptians,
That too.
that would not increase the Jewish population.
That's true too. That's a fair point and observation. So while this is serious and while this is heavy, the good news is that nothing gets past the Lord. He has a delivery and a deliverance and a victory he is working on. And it's in these horrible circumstances that a deliverer is going to be born. Just like we talk on Wednesday nights, how comparing, looking at the Bible and the new book, the Josiah Manifesto by Jonathan Cahn, it was when abortion became legalized in the States starting in 1970 through the handing down of the ruling of Roe v. Wade in 1973. In that 3-year period, when 1.3 million babies were aborted, one child that was born in that didn't get aborted was Amy Coney Barrett, who would later have an influence on Roe v. Wade. And we'll get to that in our Wednesday night stuff. So as we see here, Moses, who's one of the trains of thought in our Wednesday night discussions, Moses will be born in these horrible circumstances and yet will be protected by God and raised up to be a deliverer out of these circumstances. So never let circumstances cause us to miss the working of the Lord, and he's got a plan and a way as we stick with him. So that's a good place to wrap up for this morning, and we'll pick up getting ready for the birth of Moses. Anything else from anyone else? If not, I appreciate the interaction very much. We'll go ahead and stop our chair here for now and get ready to go before the Lord in song.